A selective commentary on principal individuals mentioned or cited in the narrative text, with biographical data and major relevant works, by David L. Hoggan. Arrowwood, Charles Flynn. Presbyterian scholar, his main fields are American education, 1750 to 1850, and medieval and modern British ecclesiastical history. He has translated and edited many important British Latin texts, that is, De Jure Regni Apud Scotus, etc. He collaborated on two important books on American education with Frederick Eby, cited below under Eby. He is also editor and commentator on a book dealing with Jefferson's educational theories and policies. He was born on November 9th, 1887 in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. He received his A.B. from Davidson College, 1909, B.D. from Union Theological Seminary, Virginia, 1915, A.M. Rice Institute, 1921, and Ph.D., University of Chicago, 1924. He was on the faculty of Rice Institute, later Rice University, from 1926 to 1955. He was visiting professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, University of Illinois, University of Colorado, and Duke University. Bagley, William Chandler. He was born on March the 15th, 1874 in Detroit, Michigan. He received his B.S. from Michigan State College, 1895, M.S., University of Wisconsin, 1898, Ph.D., Cornell University, 1900. His initial teaching experience was in public secondary and normal schools, 1895 to 97, 1901 to 8. He was Professor of Education at the University of Illinois, 1908 to 17, and at Teachers College, Columbia University, 1917 to 40. He was President of the National Society for the Study of Education, 1911 to 12, and he wrote some history texts, including one with Charles Austin Beard in 1918. He received a Commonwealth Fund grant in 1924 to lead a study of California public education. He died in 1946. The Education Process, New York, Macmillan, 1905, 358 pages. Second edition, 1906. Third edition, 1908. Fourth edition, 1912. Educational Values, New York, Macmillan, 1911, 267 pages. School Discipline, New York, Macmillan, 1914, 259 pages. An Introduction to Teaching with John Keith, New York, Macmillan, 1924, 400 pages. The California Curriculum Study with George Kite, Berkeley, California, University of California Press, 1926, 430 pages. Education, Crime and Social Progress, New York, Macmillan, 1931, 150 pages. Standard Practices in Teaching, a summary of the standards generally recognized as governing good practice in typical teaching procedures, with Marion MacDonald, New York, Macmillan, 1932, 189 pages. Education and Emergent Man, New York, Nelson, 1934, 238 pages. The Teacher of the Social Studies, with Thomas Alexander, New York, Scribner's, 1937, 328 pages. A Century of the Universal School, New York, Macmillan, 1937, 85 pages. Bernard Henry, Episcopalian 19th century American champion of public education, and, together with Carter and Mann, one of the three most important founders of the present American system of public education. His private means enabled him to travel extensively in Europe on behalf of comparative educational studies. He was a disciple of the Enlightenment of the 18th century in general, with its dominant secular impulses and of the educational theories of Pestalozzi in particular. He saw the future of all-American education in uniform and standard public instruction. He was born on January the 24th, 1811, in Hartford, Connecticut. He attended the Monson Academy in Massachusetts prior to entering Yale in 1826, where he was active in the Linnonia Literary Society. He received his B.A. from Yale in 1830 and taught school in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, prior to entering the Yale Law School, 1833 to 1834. After admission to the bar and several years of travel in Europe, he was elected to the Connecticut legislature in 1837. He became the first secretary to the Board of Commissioners of Common Schools in Connecticut, 1838 to 1842, and from 1843 to 9, he was state superintendent of schools in Rhode Island. He was principal of the New Britain, Connecticut Normal School, 1849 to 1854, and from 1855 to 81, he published his General Encyclopedia of Education. The American Journal of Education in 31 volumes, from 1858 to 1860. He was Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin and agent for the Wisconsin Normal School Regents. He was President of St. John's College, Maryland, 1866 to 7, and the first United States Commissioner of Education, 1867 to 1870. He died in Hartford in 1900. First, second, third, fourth annual reports of the Board of Commissioners of Common Schools in Connecticut, together with the first, second, third, fourth annual reports of the Secretary of the Board, Hartford. Case Tiffany and Burham, 1839 to 1843. Reports on the condition and improvement of the public schools of Rhode Island for 1845, 1846, 1847, Providence, B. Cranston and Company, 1846 to 1848. Reports and documents relating to the public schools of Rhode Island for 1848, 1849, Providence, B. Cranston and Company, 1849 to 1850. Normal schools and other institutions, agencies and means designed for the professional education of teachers, 2 volumes, Hartford, Case Tiffany, 1851. Practical illustrations of the principles of school architecture, Hartford, Case Tiffany, 1851, 175 pages. National Education in Europe, being an account of the organization, administration, instruction and statistics of public schools of different grades in the principal states, New York, C.B. Norton, 1854, 890 pages. Reformatory Education, Papers on Preventative, Correctional and Reformatory Institutions and Agencies in Different Countries, Hartford, F.C. Brownell, 1857, 363 pages. American Educational Biography, Syracuse, New York, C.W. Bardeen, 1859. Pestalozzi and Pestalozzianism, 2 volumes, New York, F.C. Brownell, 1859. Science and Art, New York, E. Steiger, 1872, 807 pages. American Educational Biography, Memoirs of Teachers, Educators and Promoters and Benefactors of Education, Science and Literature, Syracuse, New York, C.W. Bardeen, 1874, 526 pages. American Pedagogy, Education, the School and the Teacher, Hartford, Brown and Bross, 1876, 570 pages. Analytical Index to Barnard's American Journal of Education, 31 volumes, 1855 to 1881. Vide, also Library of Education, 52 volumes, Washington, D.C., Government Printing Office, 1892, 128 pages. Bestor, Arthur Eugene, Jr. He was born on September the 20th, 1908 in Chautauqua, New York. His father was president of the Chautauqua Institution for his father's views in education. Vide Arthur E. Bestor Sr., Organized Popular Education, Washington, D.C., Government Printing Office, 1917. A. E. Bestor Jr. received his Ph.B. Yale University, 1930, and Ph.D. in History, Yale University, 1938. At Yale, he instructed in literature, 1930-31, and history, 1934-36. He instructed in history at Teachers College, Columbia University, 1936-1942. He was assistant professor of humanities at Stanford from 1942 to 1946, a lecturer in history at the University of Wisconsin, 1946-7, prior to receiving a permanent appointment in history at the University of Illinois in 1947, where he has been a full professor since 1951. He was a Newbery Fellow at Chicago in 1946 and a Guggenheim Fellow 1953-4, 1961-2. He received the Albert J. Beveridge Memorial Award of the American Historical Association in 1946, and he instructed at Oxford on a Fulbright grant 1956-7. His major field, in addition to American education, is socialist theory. Chautauqua Publications, An Historical and Bibliographical Guide, Chautauqua, New York, Chautauqua Press, 1934, 67 pages. Backwoods Utopias, The Sectarian and Owenite Phases of Communitarian Socialism in America, 1663 to 1829, Philadelphia University of Pennsylvania Press, 1950, 288 pages. Educational Wastelands, The Retreat from Learning in Our Public Schools, Urbana, Illinois, University of Illinois Press, 1953, 226 pages. The Restoration of Learning, a Program for Redeeming the Unfulfilled Promise of American Education, New York, Knopf, 1955, 459 pages. American Phalanxes, A Study in the Fourierist Socialism in the United States, 2 volumes. Manuscripts, Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, Microfilm, 1956. Biddle, William Wishart. He was born on June the 19th, 1900 in Chicago, Illinois. He received his B.A. from Pomona College, 1923, prior to study at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, 1924-26. He received his Ph.D. in social psychology from Columbia University, 1932. He was a research assistant at Columbia, 1927-1930, an instructor of applied social science, Western Reserve University, 1930-33. After teaching education at Colgate, 1933-5, he was professor of education and head of the departments at Wisconsin State Teachers College, Milwaukee, 1935-1944. He was senior health specialist, United States Department of Agriculture, 1944-7, and professor of social psychology, Earlham College, 1947-60. He has been employed as an administrator by the Board of National Missions, United Presbyterian Church, since 1960. Propaganda and Education, New York, Teachers College, Columbia University, 1932, 84 pages. The Cultivation of Community Leaders, Up from the Grassroots, New York, Harper, 1953. Growth Toward Freedom, A Challenge for Campus and Community, New York, Harper, 1957, 171 pages. Bode, Boyd Henry. He was born on October the 4th, 1873, in Reddit, Illinois. He studied at Yankton College in South Dakota prior to attending Penn College, where he received his A.B. in 1896. He received his A.M. University of Michigan, 1897, and Ph.D. Cornell University, 1900. He was instructor and assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin, 1900 to 1909, and associate professor and professor of education, University of Illinois, 1909 to 1921. From 1921 to 1944, he was professor of education at Ohio State University. He did education work for the federal government after retirement, and he was visiting professor at the Institute of Education, Cairo, Egypt, 1944 to 5. He died in Gainesville, Florida, March the 29th, 1953. An Outline of Logic, New York, Henry Holt, 1910, 324 pages. Second edition, 1914. Fundamentals of Education, New York, Macmillan, 1921, 245 pages. Modern Educational Theories, New York, Macmillan, 1927, 351 pages. Conflicting Psychologies of Learning, Boston, Heath, 1929, 305 pages. Democracy as a Way of Life, the Kappa Delta Pi Lecture Series, New York, Macmillan, 1937, 114 pages. Second edition, 1943. Progressive Education at the Crossroads, New York, Newsom, 1938, 128 pages. Educational Freedom and Democracy, Second Yearbook of the John Dewey Society, New York, The Appleton Century, 1938, with H.B. Alberti. How We Learn, Boston, Heath, 1940, 308 pages. Modern Education and Human Values, Bode, editor, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, University of Pittsburgh Press, 1947. Brammells, Theodore Burkhardt Hurt. He was born on January the 20th, 1904 in Neillsville, Wisconsin. He received his B.A. from Ripon College, 1926, and Ph.D., University of Chicago, 1931. His thesis was on the role of acquiescence in Leninism, and Soviet education and society has remained one of his major fields, along with American educational theory. He was Field Secretary for Ripon College, 1926 to 28, and University of Chicago Fellow, 1928 to 31. He instructed philosophy at Long Island University, 1931 to 35, and Adelphi College, 1935 to 9. He taught philosophy at the University of Minnesota, 1939 to 47, where he first attained the rank of full professor in 1945. From 1947 to 1958, he was Professor of Education and Philosophy at New York University, and since 1958 at Boston University. He has been a visiting professor at Columbia, Dartmouth, University of Wisconsin, and University of Puerto Rico. He was Chief American Delegate to the International Education Conference in Australia in 1946. A Philosophical Approach to Communism, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1933, 242 pages. Workers' Education in the United States, Fifth Yearbook, John Dewey Society, New York, Harper, 1941. Design for America, an educational exploration of the future of democracy for senior high schools and junior colleges et al., New York, Hines, Hayden, and Eldridge, 1945. Minority Problems in the Public Schools, a study of administrative politics and practices in 7 school systems, New York, Harper, 1946. Ends and Means in Education, a Mid-Century Appraisal, New York, Harper, 1950. Patterns of Educational Philosophy, a Democratic Interpretation, Yonkers-on-Hudson, World Book Company, 1950. The Battle for Free Schools, Boston, Beacon Press, 1951, 79 pages. Philosophies of Education in Cultural Perspective, New York, Dryden Press, 1955, 446 pages. Toward a Reconstructed Philosophy of Education, New York, Dryden Press, 1956, 417 pages. Cultural Foundations of Education, An Interdisciplinary Exploration, New York, Harper, 1957. The Remaking of a Culture, Life and Education in Puerto Rico, New York, Harper, 1959. Education for the Emerging Age, Newer Ends and Stronger Means, New York, Harper, 1961, 244 pages. Breadvold, Louis Ignatius. Specialist in 17th and 18th centuries of English literature and culture, an expert on the poetry of Dryden and the politics of John Wilkes, author of numerous monographs and articles dealing with special aspects of the English Enlightenment, his importance in this context is his illuminating analysis of certain superficial 18th century ideas which have been of guiding importance to many American educators. He was born on July the 20th, 1888 in Springfield, Minnesota. He received his A.B. from the University of Minnesota, 1909, and his A.M. there the following year. He was a University of Chicago Fellow, 1913-14, and a University of Illinois Fellow, 1920-21, where he received his Ph.D. in 1921. He instructed English at Iowa State, 1914-16, and at the University of Illinois, 1916-17, 1919-20. He served in the United States Army, 1917-19. He taught English literature at the University of Michigan from 1921 to 1955. He was appointed full professor in 1930, and he was chairman of the department from 1936 to 1947. The Philosophy of Edmund Burke, editor with R.G. Ross, Ann Arbor, University of Michigan Press, 1960, 276 pages. The Brave New World of the Enlightenment, Ann Arbor, University of Michigan Press, 1961. Brubaker, John Seiler. He was born October the 18th, 1898 in East Hampton, Massachusetts. He received his A.B. from Yale University in 1920, his LL.B. from Harvard 1923, and his Ph.D. from Columbia 1928. He was in the United States Army 1918-19, and he was an instructor in history at Dartmouth 1924-5, after serving as an assistant professor of education at Columbia 1927-8. He went to Yale in 1928 to teach history and the philosophy of education. He has been a full professor since 1946. The judicial power of the New York State Commissioner of Education, New York Teachers College, Columbia, 1927, 173 pages. Henry Barnard on Education, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1931, 298 pages. Modern Philosophies of Education, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1939, 370 pages. Second edition, 1950, 349 pages. Third edition, 1962, 373 pages. The Public Schools and Spiritual Values, 7th John Dewey Society Yearbook, New York, Harper, 1944, 222 pages. A History of the Problems of Education, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1947, 688 pages. Bryson, Lyman Lloyd. He was born on July the 12th, 1888 in Valentine, Nebraska. He received his A.B. from the University of Michigan in 1910 and his A.M. there in 1915. He was employed on the editorial staffs of the Omaha Daily Bee 1907 to 1911 Omaha Daily News, 1911-12, and Detroit Evening News, 1912-13. He was instructor and assistant professor of rhetoric and journalism, University of Michigan, 1913-17. From 1970 to 20, he was employed by the Red Cross in Washington, D.C. and Paris, France. From 1920 to 1934, he was employed as a public relations expert by the League of Red Cross Societies. During this period, he was also an extension lecturer for the University of California, 1925 to 32. He was invited to Columbia as visiting professor of education, 1934 to 5, and he remained there on a permanent appointment, 1935 to 1955, except for his 3 years in the crucial post of Chief, Bureau of Special Operations, Office of War Information, 1942 to 5. He died in 1959. A State Plan for Adult Education, California, New York, American Association for Adult Education, 1934, 69 pages. Which Way America? Communism, Fascism, Democracy, New York, Macmillan, 1939, 113 pages. Adult Education, New York, American Book Company, 1936, 208 pages. The New Prometheus, New York, Macmillan, 1941, 107 pages. Science and Freedom, New York, Columbia University Press, 1947, 191 pages. The Next America, Prophecy and Faith, New York, Harper's, 1952, 248 pages. An Outline of Man's Knowledge, Garden City, New York, Doubleday, 1960, 692 pages. Buckley, William F. Jr. He was born on November 24th, 1925 in New York City. He studied at the University of Mexico in 1943 prior to serving in the United States Army, 1944 to 6. He entered Yale University and received his B.A. in 1950. He served as senior editor for American Mercury in 1952. He has been editor-in-chief of National Review and one of its principal contributors since 1955. God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom, Chicago, Regency, 1951, 240 pages. McCarthy and His Enemies, The Record and Its Meaning, with I. Brent Bozell, Chicago, Regnery, 1954, 413 pages. Up from Liberalism, New York, McDowell, Oblensky, 1959, 205 pages. The Committee and Its Critics, A Cam Review of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, et al., New York, Putnam, 1962, 352 pages. Butler, Nicholas Murray. He was born on April 2nd, 1862 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. He received his A.B. from Columbia University in 1882, his A.M. there in 1883, and his Ph.D. there in 1884. From 1884 to 1886, he engaged in postgraduate studies in education at Paris and Berlin. Returning to the United States, he launched and directed the New York College for the Training of Teachers in 1886, and directed it until 1891, when he became Dean of the Faculty at Columbia, of which the Teachers' College was a part. From 1901 to 1945, he was President of Columbia. He was also President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, 1925 to 1945. He died in New York City on December 7th, 1947. Education in the United States. Butler editor and contributor. A series of monographs prepared for the United States exhibits at the Paris Exposition, 1900. 2 volumes, Albany, New York, Lyon, 1900. True and False Democracy, New York, Macmillan, 1907, 111 pages, second edition, 1940. The International Mind, An Argument for the Judicial Settlement of International Disputes, New York, Scribner's, 1912, 121 pages. A World in Ferment, Interpretations of the War for a New World, New York, Scribner's, 1917, 254 pages. Is America Worth Saving? New York, Scribner's, 1928, 398 pages. The Faith of a Liberal, Essays and Addresses on Political Principles and Public Policies, New York, Scribner's, 1924, 369 pages. Between Two Worlds, Interpretations of the Age in Which We Live, New York, Scribner's, 1934, 450 pages. The Family of Nations, Its Need and Its Problems, New York, Scribner's, 1938, 400 pages. Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, Essays and Addresses on the Problems of Today and Tomorrow, New York, Scribner's, 1942, 240 pages. Butts, R. Freeman. He was born on May the 14th, 1910 in Springfield, Illinois. He received the following degrees from the University of Wisconsin: A.B. 1931, A.M. 1932, Ph.D. 1935. After a period of postgraduate instruction in Wisconsin, he joined the faculty of Teachers College, Columbia in 1938, where he has remained as a full professor since 1947. He was Executive Officer, Division of Foundations of Education, Teachers College, 1946 to 1956, and Director of the Division, 1956 to 1960. Since 1961, he has been Director of International Studies, Teachers College. The development of the principle of election of studies in American colleges and universities, unpublished PhD thesis, University of Wisconsin, 1935. Abstract, Fly News, Volume 13, Number 1, February 1936. The college charts its course. Historical Conceptions and Current Proposals, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1939, 464 pages. A Cultural History of Education, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1947, 726 pages. Second edition, A Cultural History of Western Education, Ibid, 1955, 645 pages. The American Tradition in Religion and Education, Boston, Beacon Press, 1950, 230 pages. A History of Education in American Culture, with L.A. Kremen, New York, Holt, 1953, 628 pages. Carr, William George. He was born June 1st, 1901 in Northampton, England, and he came to the United States with his parents at the age of 14 in the autumn of 1915. He studied at the University of California at Berkeley, 1920 to 23, prior to attending Stanford, where he received the following degrees: A.B. 1924, A.M. 1926, Ph.D. 1929. He taught in the Roosevelt Junior High School at Glendale, California, 1924 to 25. He was instructor in education, Pacific University, 1926 to 7. And in 1928 to 9, he was Director of Research for the California Teachers Association. The National Educational Association appointed him Assistant Director of Research in 1929 and promoted him to Director 1931 to 40. He was Associate Secretary of the National Educational Association from 1940 to 1952, and he has been Executive Secretary since 1952. He has been Visiting Professor of Education Summer Sessions at Stanford, 1929, 1931, 1942. At the University of Michigan, 1930, 1933, 1934, 1936, 1937, 1938. At University of California at Los Angeles, 1935. At University of California at Berkeley, 1939. At University of Oregon, 1940. At University of Pennsylvania, 1941. In addition to his regular work for UNESCO, he was consultant, United States Delegation, UNESCO Mexico City Conference, 1947. He was also in charge of the American delegation at the Mideast Teacher Exchange Conference, Cairo, Egypt, 1951. Education for World Citizenship, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press, 1928, 225 pages. The County Unit of School Administration, New York, H. W. Wilson, 1931, 144 pages. The Lesson Assignment with John Wage, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press, 1931, 98 pages. John Swett, The Biography of an Educational Pioneer, Santa Ana, California, Fine Art Press, 1933, 173 pages. The Purposes of Education in American Democracy, Washington, D.C., National Educational Association, 1938. Educational Leadership in This Emergency, Coverley Lecture, July 20th, 1941, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press, 1942, 32 pages. International Frontiers in Education, Philadelphia, American Academy of Political and Social Science, 1944, 180 pages. Carter, James Gordon. Educator and dedicated disciple of Pestalozzi, he was the decisive leader of the movement for free state education. He began the campaign in 1820, which attracted the attention of Horace Mann only much later. He was virtually a broken man after being superseded by Mann in 1837 and did little for his cause after that time. His main academic field was geography, and he published several textbooks on the geography of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. He was born on September the 7th, 1795, in Leominster, Massachusetts. His father, Captain James Carter, was a prosperous man. He attended Groton Academy prior to entering Harvard College, where he received his B.A. in 1920. He was director and teacher at the Cohasset School 1920-23 and at the Lancaster School 1923-30. He published articles advocating state education in the 1820s in the Boston Transcript and the Boston Patriot. His effort on behalf of a state normal school failed by only one vote in the Massachusetts Senate in 1827. He entered the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1835, where he was chairman of the Committee on Education. After 1837, when Mann was placed in charge of the public education program, he served a term in the Massachusetts Senate. He died in Chicago, July the 21st, 1849. Letters to the Honourable William Prescott on the Free Schools of New England, with remarks upon the principles of instruction, Cummings, Hilliard and Company, Boston, 1824, 123 pages. Essays upon popular education, containing a particular examination of the schools of Massachusetts and an outline of the Institution for the Education of Teachers, Bowles and Dearborn, Boston, 1826, 60 pages. Cattell, James McKean. He was born on May the 25th, 1860 in Easton, Pennsylvania. His father, Reverend William C. Cattell, was president of Lafayette College. He received 2 degrees from his father's college, A.B. 1880, A.M. 1883. He then studied at Göttingen, Leipzig, Paris, and Geneva, 1880 to 1882. He was a Johns Hopkins Fellow, 1882 to 3, prior to returning to Europe, where he was a student and scientific assistant at the University of Leipzig, 1883 to 6. He received his Leipzig PhD in 1886. He lectured at University of Pennsylvania and Bryn Mawr, 1886 to 8. In 1888, he was also invited to offer a course of guest lectures in educational psychology at the University of Cambridge, England. He was professor and chairman of the Department of Psychology, University of Pennsylvania, 1888 to 91. He was professor of psychology and education at Columbia from 1891 to 1917. From 1894 to 1904, he was editor of the Psychological Review, and in 1915 he founded School and Society, taking the name from the title of the famous book by John Dewey. He remained editor of this publication until 1939. He was named trustee of Science Service in 1920, and he was president of this foundation from 1928 to 1937. He died on January the 20th, 1944. American Men of Science, a biographical directory. Founder and editor of the first 6 editions, New York, Science Press, 1906, 1910, 1921, 1927, 1933, 1938. University Control, New York, Science Press, 1913, 484 pages. Second edition, New York, Sagamore Press, 1957. Carnegie Pensions, New York, Science Press, 1919, 253 pages. Leaders in Education, founder and editor of the first 2 editions, New York, Science Press, 1932, 1941. Clark, Gordon Haddon. He was born on August the 31st, 1902 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He received the following degrees from the University of Pennsylvania: A.B. 1924, Ph.D. 1929. He was instructor and assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania from 1924 to 1937, and associate professor of philosophy at Wheaton College, 1937 to 43. Since 1945, he has instructed at Butler University, where he has been a full professor since 1948. He was visiting professor, Theological Seminary of the Reformed Episcopal Church, 1931 to 6. A Christian View of Man and Things, Grand Rapids, Eardsman, 1952, 325 pages. Dewey, Philadelphia, Presbyterian and Reformed Publishing Company, 1960, 69 pages. Religion, Reason and Revelation, Philadelphia, Presbyterian and Reformed Publishing Company, 1961, 241 pages. Karl Barth's Theological Method, Philadelphia, Presbyterian and Reformed Publishing Company, 1963, 275 pages. James, Philadelphia, Presbyterian and Reformed Publishing Company, 1963, 58 pages. Conant, James Bryant. Scientist and educator, example of the scientist in education, he made the following declaration at the massive Harvard tercentenary celebration in 1936, when 67 honorary degrees were awarded. The origin of the Constitution must be dissected as fearlessly as the geologist examines the origin of rocks. He was born on March the 26th, 1893 in Dorchester, Massachusetts. From Harvard he received his A.B. in 1913 and his PhD 1916. He joined the chemistry department at Harvard the same year, and he was promoted to full professor in 1927. He succeeded Lowell as president of Harvard in 1933. His influence as president was slight, and in 1953 he resigned to become United States High Commissioner in West Germany. After his return from Germany in 1957, he was given a permanent assignment by the Carnegie Foundation to investigate American education. He was chairman of the National Defense Research Commission from 1941 to 1946. Speaking as a private citizen, addresses on the present threats to our nation's future, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1941, 38 pages. Education in a Divided World, the Function of the Public Schools in Our Unique Society, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1948, 249 pages. Education and Liberty, the Role of the Schools in a Modern Democracy, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1953, 168 pages. Recommendations for Education in the Junior High School Years, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1960, 46 pages. Slums and Suburbs, a Commentary on Schools in Metropolitan Areas, New York, McGraw-Hill, 1961, 147 pages. Counts, George Sylvester. Educator, member of the Liberal Party since 1955, and formerly member of the American Labour Party. As a teacher, writer, and chairman of the Committee of the Progressive Education Association on Social and Economic Problems, he has exerted an extensive influence on American education. He was born on December 9, 1889, in Baldwin City, Kansas. He received his A.B. from Parker University in Kansas, 1911, and his Ph.D., University of Chicago, 1916. He was head of the Department of Education at Delaware College, 1916 to 18, professor of education and sociology at Harris Teachers College, St. Louis, 1918 to 19, and professor of secondary education at the University of Washington in St. Louis, 1919 to 20. He was professor of education at Yale, 1920 to 6, and at the University of Chicago, 1926 to 7. From 1927 to 1956, he was professor of education at Teachers College, Columbia University, 1927 to 56, until retirement from teaching. In 1946, he headed the United States Education Mission to Japan. The Selective Character of American Secondary Education, Chicago University of Chicago Press, 1922, 162 pages. Principles of Education, with J. Crosby Chapman, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1924. The Senior High School Curriculum, Chicago University of Chicago Press, 1926, 160 pages. The Social Composition of Boards of Education, a study in the social control of public education, Chicago University of Chicago Press, 1927, 100 pages. School and Society in Chicago, New York, Harcourt, Brace and Company, 1928, 367 pages. Secondary Education and Industrialism, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1929, 70 pages. The American Road to Culture, a Social Interpretation of Education in the United States, New York, John Day, 1930, 194 pages. A Ford Crosses Soviet Russia, Boston, Stratford, 1930, 223 pages. The Soviet Challenge to America, New York, John Day, 1931, 372 pages. Dare the Schools Build a New Social Order? John Day Pamphlets, New York, John Day, 1932, 56 pages. A Call to the Teachers of the Nation, John Day Pamphlets, New York, John Day, 1933, 44 pages. The Social Foundations of Education, et al., New York, Scribner, 1934, 579 pages. The Prospects of American Democracy, New York, John Day, 1938, 370 pages. The Relations of Public Education and Private Enterprise, New York, Teachers College, Columbia University Press, 1938, 33 pages. Education and the Promise of America, Kappa Delta Pi Lecture Series, Volume 17, New York, Macmillan, 1945. The Challenge of Soviet Education, et al., New York, McGraw-Hill, 1957, 330 pages. Cubberley, Elwood Patterson. He was born on June 6, 1868 in Andrews, Indiana. He received his A.B. from Indiana University, 1891, A.M. Columbia, 1902, Ph.D. Columbia, 1905. He was professor and president at Vincennes University, 1891-6, and city superintendent of schools, San Diego, California, 1896-8. Prior to joining the Stanford University faculty as Associate Professor of Education in 1898, he was promoted to full professor in 1906, and from 1917 until his retirement in 1933, he was Dean of the Stanford School of Education. During his Stanford career, he also directed municipal school surveys in Portland, Oregon, and Salt Lake City, Utah. He died on September 15, 1941. Syllabus of Lectures on the History of Education with Selected Bibliographies, 2 volumes, London, Macmillan, 1902. School Funds and Their Apportionment, a consideration of the subject with reference to a more general equalization of both the burdens and the advantages of education. New York, Teachers College, Columbia University Press, 1905, 255 pages. Changing Conceptions of Education, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1909, 69 pages. State and County Educational Reorganization, the Revised Constitution and School Code of the State of Osceola, New York, Macmillan, 1914, 257 pages. School Organization and Administration, a concrete study based on the Salt Lake City School Surveys, et al., Yonkers-on-Hudson, New York, World Book Company, 1916, 346 pages. Public Education in the United States, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1919, 517 pages. Second edition, 1934, 782 pages. The History of Education, Educational Practice and Progress Considered as a Phase of the Development and Spread of Western Civilization, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1920, 849 pages. The Principal and His School, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1923, 571 pages. An Introduction to the Study of Education, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1925, 476 pages. Second edition, 1933, 532 pages. State School Administration, a Textbook of Principles, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1927, 773 pages. Curti, Merle Eugene. He was born on September 15, 1897, in Papillon, Nebraska. From Harvard, he received the following degrees: A.B. 1920, A.M. 1921, Ph.D. 1927. He instructed history at Beloit College 1921-2 and studied at the Sorbonne 1924-5. He taught at Smith College from 1925 to 1937, and he was promoted to full professor in 1929. He was professor in the history of education at Teachers College, Columbia from 1937 to 1942. Since 1942, he has been professor of history at the University of Wisconsin. He was visiting professor in India 1946-7 and Japan 1959-60. Social Ideas of American Educators, New York, Scribner's, 1935, 613 pages. Second edition with new preface, Paterson, New Jersey, Littlefield Adams, 1959, 613 pages. Peace or War? The American Struggle, 1636 to 1936, New York, W. W. Norton, 1936, 374 pages. American Scholarship in the 20th Century, et al., Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 252 pages. Probing Our Past, New York, Harper, 1955, 294 pages. Dearborn, Ned Harland. He was born on June 2nd, 1893, in Conneautville, Pennsylvania. He graduated from the State Normal School at Edinburgh, Pennsylvania in 1912 and began his career as a secondary school teacher in Erie and Crawford counties, Pennsylvania, where he was also a principal and school superintendent, 1912 to 21. From 1920 to 1923, he was training director at the State Normal School, Oswego, New York. He was assistant to the director of the Commonwealth Fund in New York City from 1923 to 1925, and during this period he completed his graduate studies. From Columbia, he received the M.A. in 1924 and Ph.D. 1925. From 1925 to 1929, he was director of the Teacher Training Division of the New York State Department of Education. From 1929 to 1959, he was professor of education at New York University. He was appointed Dean of the Division of General Education, New York University, 1934, Executive Vice President, 1942, and from 1944 to 1959, he was President of the Division. During the latter years, he was also Director of the National Safety Council. The Oswego Movement in American Education, New York, Columbia University Press, 1925, 189 pages. An Introduction to Teaching, New York, D. Appleton, 1925, 337 pages. Once in a Lifetime, A Guide to CCC Camp, New York, Merrill, 1935, 302 pages. Second edition, 1936, 308 pages. DeGarmo, Charles. Quaker educator and leading American proponents of the Herbartian doctrine, many of the American educators, such as Kilpatrick, have testified to the decisive influence he exerted upon their thinking. He was an indefatigable lecturer, and he travelled throughout the country, expounding his ideas after becoming president of Swarthmore. He was born on January the 7th, 1849, in Mukwonago, Wisconsin. He graduated from the Illinois State Normal School in 1873. From 1873 to 6, he was a secondary school principal. He returned to Illinois State Normal School to instruct in education 1876 to 1883, and during this period he edited the Illinois School Journal. From 1883 to 6, he studied at Jena and Halle in Germany, receiving his Ph.D. from Halle in 1886. He returned to the Illinois State Normal School to teach modern languages 1886 to 90, and he was professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois 1890 to 1. He was appointed the third president of Swarthmore College in 1891 where he remained until 1923. During this period, he was also visiting professor of education at Cornell University. He died in 1934. The Essentials of Method, a discussion of the essential form of right methods in teaching. Boston, Heath, 1889, 119 pages. Herbert and the Herbartians, New York, Scribner, 1895, 268 pages. Second edition, 1896. A Perception, a monograph on psychology and pedagogy, by Carl Lange, editor, translated by C. de Garmo, Boston, Heath, 1896. Language Lessons, New York, Werner, 1897, 256 pages. Outlines of Educational Doctrine, J. F. Herbert, annotated and translated by C. de Garmo, New York, Macmillan, 1901. Interest and Education, the Doctrine of Interest and its Concrete Application, New York, Macmillan, 1902, 230 pages, second edition, 1903. Principles of Secondary Education, 3 volumes, New York, Macmillan, 1907 to 1910. Aesthetic Education, Syracuse, New York, Bardeen, 1913, 161 pages. Essentials of Design, with Leon Loyal Winslow, New York, Macmillan, 1924, 225 pages.